There was a time when thinking for yourself felt natural, even noble. Questioning authority, exploring ideas, and forming independent opinions were signs of intelligence and maturity. But in the modern world, that same impulse can feel dangerous. Every thought is monitored, filtered, or judged. Every opinion risks exile from some group, some ideology, some collective identity. Thinking for yourself doesn't just feel rebellious anymore. It feels forbidden. But why? Psychologically, this tension isn't new. Carl Jung once said that the greatest threat to freedom is the crowd. He didn't mean political tyranny, but psychological conformity. The subtle pressure to think, speak, and feel as everyone else does. The collective mind has always feared the individual who sees differently, because free thought, by its nature, disrupts systems built on sameness. It asks uncomfortable questions. It resists automatic agreement. And that kind of person is hard to control. We live in an era of unprecedented connection, yet that connection has quietly become surveillance. Our ideas are no longer private. They live in digital spaces that reward approval and punish deviation. The algorithms amplify outrage and conformity at the same time. We've created a hive of voices that sound distinct but think alike. It's not that people can't think for themselves. It's that doing so now carries social risk. To say something unapproved is to risk exile from the digital tribe. So most people stop at the threshold of real thought, afraid to cross it. This fear has psychological roots. Human beings are social creatures. Belonging once meant survival. Rejection, even now, registers in the brain as pain. When you express an unpopular opinion, the body reacts as though facing physical danger. Elevated heart rate, anxiety, stress. The primitive mind doesn't distinguish between exile from the tribe and threat to life. So, we conform. We imitate opinions not because they're true, but because they feel safe. Jung called this the collective persona, the mask we wear to be accepted by society. Behind it hides our true voice, silenced for the sake of belonging. Thinking for yourself requires solitude, and solitude is disappearing. The constant hum of media fills every silence. People used to reflect while walking, driving, or waiting. Now, those quiet moments are occupied by scrolling, opinions, and noise. The inner voice struggles to speak beneath the static. The result is what psychologists call cognitive outsourcing, letting external sources do our thinking for us. We no longer ask, "What do I believe?" but "Who agrees with me?" Our mental independence erodes not through censorship, but convenience. There's another layer, moral polarization. The modern landscape divides everything. Good versus evil, right versus wrong, us versus them. When you form an independent opinion, someone will accuse you of betrayal. You can't simply question an idea. You must belong to one camp or another. That binary thinking traps people in what Jung called participation mystique, losing individuality inside the collective psyche. When the group defines identity, disagreement feels like self-annihilation. So people suppress critical thought to protect emotional security. In this way, thinking for yourself doesn't feel illegal by law. It feels illegal by emotion. The punishment isn't imprisonment, it's shame. The fear of ridicule, cancellation, or public attack conditions the mind to self-censor. The crowd doesn't need to silence you. It teaches you to silence yourself. Over time, this becomes habit. We pre-edit our ideas before they're even formed. We hide nuance because nuance doesn't perform well online. The collective prefers certainty, slogans, and outrage, not complexity. Jung believed that mass culture always pulls toward unconsciousness. When people think as a crowd, their moral and intellectual levels drop. The group mind simplifies, exaggerates, and erases subtlety. That's why propaganda thrives in every age, not because people are ignorant, but because they're tired. Thinking independently takes effort. It requires doubt, patience, and humility. The collective offers an easier path, ready-made opinions packaged as virtue. You don't have to wrestle with truth. You just repeat the approved phrase and belong. This is why the modern thinker feels lonely. To think for yourself now means to step outside the collective trance. It means standing in uncertainty while everyone else chants certainty. It means valuing truth over applause. That's not easy because the psyche longs for validation. Jung said that the greatest moral decision of our time is whether we will remain individuals or dissolve into the crowd. Most choose comfort. The few who resist often feel like outlaws, not because they've done wrong, but because they've remembered how to think. Social media, for all its gifts, has accelerated a psychological phenomenon called social mirroring. We see our worth reflected through feedback. Likes, comments, approval. The brain releases dopamine in response. But dopamine is not happiness. It's reinforcement. The system trains us to produce agreeable thoughts because they yield reward. Independent thought, by contrast, triggers uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't trend. The more we chase approval, the more we lose our intellectual autonomy. What's fascinating is that many people believe they're independent thinkers while unknowingly recycling the same narratives. This illusion of individuality is part of the collective's genius. It gives everyone a label, a team, or a moral cause, the appearance of uniqueness within uniformity. Jung would call this identification with an archetype, when the ego merges with a larger story and mistakes it for selfhood. People say they're finding their tribe, but often they're just exchanging one set of opinions for another. The mind stays domesticated, only under a different flag. The true individual, however, doesn't seek a flag. They seek understanding. They're not driven by rebellion for its own sake, but by curiosity. They ask the forbidden questions, not to provoke, but to know. And that curiosity threatens every system that relies on obedience. Throughout history, societies have feared thinkers more than criminals. Because criminals break laws, thinkers question them. The crowd can punish action, but it can't easily control consciousness. So it labels independent thought as arrogance, madness, or immorality. There's a deep psychological comfort in consensus. Agreement feels like safety, but safety is not always truth. Jung observed that societies often project their shadow, their repressed darkness, onto dissenters. The individual who thinks differently becomes the scapegoat carrying the group's hidden fears. By condemning him, the crowd avoids looking inward. In today's world, that scapegoating happens digitally. A public ritual of outrage that reaffirms group purity. Every era has its heretics. Ours just trends on the front page. But something strange happens when you resist this pressure. When you stop parroting and start reflecting, you feel disoriented at first, like stepping off a moving train. The silence feels wrong, the solitude unnatural. But soon, another sensation emerges: freedom. You begin to notice your own thoughts forming independently of algorithms and slogans. You realize how much of your identity was borrowed. You see how the crowd's rhythm once dictated your pace. And for the first time, you experience real autonomy. Terrifying at first, but profoundly alive. Thinking for yourself means embracing complexity. It means holding two conflicting ideas without rushing to resolve them. It means accepting that truth isn't always clear, that morality isn't always binary, and that certainty often hides fear. This level of consciousness demands maturity. The immature mind seeks comfort in absolutes. The mature mind finds strength in ambiguity. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires enduring tension between opposites. The individual who thinks freely lives in that tension daily. Psychologically, this independence often begins with disillusionment. You realize the institutions you trusted, education, media, politics, even culture, don't always reward truth, but loyalty. You feel betrayed, but also liberated. That betrayal is the birth of discernment. You start reading beyond headlines, questioning motives, analyzing bias. You begin to see that information is power, and power rarely tells the full truth. Jung would say you've entered the confrontation with the shadow of society itself. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Yet independence of thought doesn't mean arrogance or cynicism. True free thinkers are humble. They know how little they know. They don't reject consensus out of ego, but examine it with care. They recognize that the mind is full of unconscious influences, upbringing, trauma, language, culture. To think freely is to become aware of those influences, not to pretend they don't exist. It's not about being contrarian. It's about being conscious. The tragedy of our time is that we've confused noise with knowledge. We mistake reaction for reflection. Every issue becomes a performance, every opinion a brand. The algorithms reward the loud, not the wise. The more extreme the statement, the greater the reach. But wisdom rarely shouts. It pauses, doubts, considers. The thinker who still practices that kind of reflection now seems almost alien. Too slow for the feed, too careful for virality. So we call them outdated, elitist, or irrelevant. In truth, they're preserving the last form of real intelligence left, the ability to sit with one's own mind. Why does thinking for yourself feel illegal now? Because it breaks an unspoken law, the law of psychological comfort. The crowd demands agreement to preserve its illusion of harmony. Dissent introduces anxiety, and anxiety must be punished. But the punishment isn't for the dissenter alone. It's for the crowd's own fear of awareness. Jung called this mass unconsciousness, a psychic regression where people prefer illusion to responsibility. It's easier to blame the heretic than to examine the truth he reveals. The antidote, Jung believed, is self-knowledge. The individual must anchor in their own values and perceptions, not in the shifting moods of the collective. That doesn't mean rejecting all social norms, but testing them consciously. Ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true or because it's comfortable? Because it's right or because it's rewarded? Each question pulls you further out of the trance. Each moment of awareness weakens the crowd's spell. Thinking for yourself also means accepting solitude as part of the path. The mind cannot be free if it's addicted to constant feedback. You need space to think privately, to let ideas grow without performance. Turn off the noise. Read slowly. Reflect quietly. These small acts are revolutionary now. In an age of performative thought, privacy itself is rebellion. Silence is freedom. Solitude is sovereignty. But independence doesn't mean isolation. Jung warned against severing completely from the collective. That way lies alienation and bitterness. The goal is not to reject society, but to engage it consciously. To speak your truth with humility. To listen deeply, and to stay open to correction without surrendering your voice. The free thinker doesn't wage war on the crowd. They simply refuse hypnosis. They walk among others, but remain awake. Eventually, you learn that thinking for yourself is less about intellect and more about courage. The courage to say, I don't know. The courage to stand alone when agreement feels easier. The courage to risk misunderstanding. Every era has needed such minds, those who can see beyond the fog of popular belief. But our era needs them most because the fog is digital, constant, and seductive. Carl Jung once said that, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you." That's the essence of this struggle. If you don't think for yourself, the world will think for you. Through algorithms, institutions, and social pressure. You will become a reflection of what's trending, not what's true. Thinking for yourself feels illegal because the world profits from your obedience. But no system can own a mind that chooses awareness. So start small. Question one idea you've always taken for granted. Read a perspective you disagree with. Sit in silence before you post. Notice the impulse to belong and the deeper impulse to understand. That moment of hesitation is consciousness awakening. That's where individuality begins. The world doesn't need louder opinions. It needs quieter minds. Minds willing to think slowly, honestly, and independently. Minds willing to stand in the uncertainty that truth demands. Because while conformity feels safe, it's awareness that keeps us human. Thinking for yourself may feel illegal now, but it's not. It's just rare. And that rarity is your proof that you're alive, conscious and free in a world that has forgotten how to be.